This talk is called How to Fathom Timelessness, originally via Spinozaism and psychedelics. I'm going to be concerned really with two main questions. The first one is, why would time not be real vis-a-vis timelessness? And secondly, is timelessness experiential? Can one experience being outside of time? And to that, I'll give two affirmative answers, or, well, two and a half almost. Firstly, I'll say yes via the philosopher Spinoza's concept of amor Dei intellectualis, or the intellectual love of God. I'll say yes by the classic mystics' accounts. And also, at the end, I'll talk about the experience of one of the most potent of all psychedelic drugs, 5-MeO-DMT. Let us begin then. Why would time not be real? Two aspects of this. The questions, what is time anyway? And what is the eternal, that which is outside of time? So we start with this. What is time? There are many aspects of this, and it's obviously a huge question that no one's really answered fully. But I'll go through a few aspects of time and suggest why we might hold the unreality of it. So first of all, time refers to duration. That is experienced change. Everything you see around you is constantly changing. Even if you move your head, that's change. And even if you see complete blackness, there's still change in terms of the accumulation of memory. So you can't avoid duration in prosaic consciousness and everyday consciousness. Duration is part of lived experience. So that's the most common notion of time. Of course, time itself, in that sense, then, when I say time, it's an abstraction from duration. So the real thing we experience is the change, the perception of the change of things, and of our mind, and from that whole experience, we sort of extract the abstraction that is time, and then often, in physics especially, we put time on a timeline, an abstracted spatial representation of time. So you can compare these two. First of all, these two basic elements of time. First, there's then lived experience duration, and then there's the abstract timeline, like with which is divided into T1, T2, and so on and so forth, which is used in physics and so on, mathematics and whatnot. Secondly, we must distinguish, when we talk about time, the triplicity that is past, present, and future. This is the essence of time, according to Jeremy McTaggart, who was a British idealist at Cambridge. He wrote this great text in 1908, published it in 1908, called The Unreality of Time, where he argues that the past, present, and future, which is the essence of time, is merely subjective. It can't really be properties of events themselves, because they couldn't have all those three attributes at once, which he's, much more complicated way than I'm explaining it, but which he then leads him on to say that, in absolute reality, mind-independent reality, we can't have past, present, and future. This is also, of course, the view of the classic idealists, especially Kant, who says time is merely a projection of our mind and doesn't exist in the world out there in itself, the world in itself, the noumena, the thing in itself. So we can distinguish in time this triplicity, past, present, and future. And I should just emphasize this fact that in physics and science, there is no such thing as the present moment as compared to the past and the future. The present moment is determined by the mind itself. So you take away the mind, and you've taken away that fundamental aspect of time itself. What are you left with? Well, you can still talk about the order of events, the C-series, as McTaggart calls it, which are not subjective, but objective. So, first A happens, and B, then C, then D, then E, and so on and so forth. This seems to be objective, although it comes into question when you consider relativity. So there's the first, I'll just summarize so far, there's the first pair of duration versus timeline. There's a second aspect, which is triplicity as against the order of events. Another aspect of time, very important, is what William James called the specious present. That means the length, the duration of the present moment. And again, this is, you can't say that this is an objective fact, a mind-independent fact, rather, of the universe. The specious present, the length of the present moment, the now, is very much determined, again, by our minds, and it can extend and it can contract. Related to that is what Henri Bergson calls the rhythm of duration, or the speed of time. Even this is very subjective, which means that speed of time rather can change according to one's predicament, human's predicament, but also according to species. So there is evidence that different species perceive time faster or slower than we do. For example, a fly might perceive our whacking of it in slow motion, unfortunately. Also, I remember, like, for example, my brother told me of this very peculiar incident only some months ago, where he was riding his bike very fast, and suddenly a toddler ran onto the road in front of him, and he held his brakes, his back brake, but it wasn't slowing down enough. So he held the front brake, and then he tipped over. Luckily, flew over the child and, well, hurt himself landing, but luckily an arc that avoided the child. But anyway, the interesting aspect of that was, this is a known phenomenon. Everything for him suddenly slowed down. He was sort of moving very slowly, and he could perceive the child, the parents in disarray, and so on. And so for him then, the rhythm of duration, the speed of time, was suddenly slowed down. And again, this is a subjective aspect of his mind due to the danger of his predicament. So again, we can say that this rhythm is subjective, not mind-independent. Fourthly, we can consider time as the fourth spatial dimension, vis-a-vis Minkowski and Einstein. Minkowski was Einstein's mathematics teacher. I mean, there was, before 1905, when the first theory of relativity came out, there were good mathematical theories as to why there were more than three spatial dimensions, stemming really from Riemann, who proved that you can have a geometry based on multiple dimensions of space, not just the three that we presuppose. I mean, Aristotle said that, physicality is three-dimensional. That's just it. There cannot possibly be more without contradiction. But this seemed to be, at least theoretically, mathematically, not right. So Riemann proved that you can get very coherent geometries then based on 4 dimensions, 5 ad infinitum. But it was Minkowski really who suggested that time was a spatial dimension, which is hard to fathom. It wasn't, I mean, Minkowski sort of formulated it mathematically, but this idea was already prevalent before him. I mean, even in The Time Machine, the novel, you can see this idea from 1895, I think it was, H.G. Wells. But anyway, Minkowski Einstein then, heralding the theory of relativity, said that time is a fourth spatial dimension. This was, this is still controversial, of course. I mean, spatial dimensions are unidirectional. You can go left and right, up and down, forward and backwards, of course, but you can't go backwards in time, it seems. Time seems to be a one-way dimension. And Bergson, there was an interesting discussion with the French philosopher Henri Bergson and Einstein in relation to this. But nonetheless, there has been proved that one's velocity in space affects the speed of time. So the faster you go, the slower time goes relative to other times. And also, interestingly, then with gravity, the closer you are to a gravitational point, the faster time goes as well. Now, interestingly, interesting to what I'm going to say later, Einstein was an avowed Spinozist, a follower of the philosopher Benedict de Spinoza. Einstein wrote in 1929, "I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the harmony of all that exists." So I'll talk about Spinoza's God in a moment, but...
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.